All right, well, welcome to another session of the 69th Annual Utah State Historical Society Annual Conference. My name is Jedediah Rogers with the Utah State Historical Society, and I'm honored today to be joined by the two foremost authorities on the history of the Utah War, joining us to talk about an interesting, surprising documentary find or discovery of a coded letter written by Brigham Young. And so they'll walk us through how they came to know about this document and the process of uncoding it and a bit about what it means for the study of the Utah War. They'll have much more to say about all of that. Any new information that's uncovered on the multiple contours of the Utah War is surprising, given just how much both of these gentlemen have themselves researched and published over the years. So it's a pleasure for me to hear from these two experts on their latest find. I'm going to introduce them first, introduce Ken Alford and then Bill MacKinnon, and then I'll turn it over to them. After their presentations, I'll have a few questions and enter into somewhat of a dialogue with them. But start with Kenneth L. Alford, is an honorary life member of the Utah State Historical Society, a professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University, the current Ephraim Hatch Teaching and Learning Faculty Fellow, and a retired colonel in the U.S. Army. Prior to BYU, he was a professor of computer science at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and a department chair and professor of strategic leadership and organizational behavior at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He resides in Springfield, Utah. And William P. MacKinnon is a fellow and an honorary life member of the Utah State Historical Society. Since 1963, his articles, essays, and book reviews have appeared in 18 issues of Utah Historical Quarterly. Let me just say, Bill, that's tremendous. You've made a huge impact on the scholarship. Bill MacKinnon has been a presiding officer of the Mormon History Association, the Santa Barbara Chorale of the Westerners, Yale Library Associates, and Children's Hospital of Michigan. He is an alumni or veteran of Yale College, Harvard Graduate School of Business Administration, General Motors Corporation, and the U.S. Air Force. He resides in Montecito, California. So again, it's a pleasure to have both of you here talking about this. I will turn it over to you for your presentations.
Well, so we'll put some slides up here. I will just add one thing at the first, and that is the genuine expert on the Utah War is Bill MacKinnon, hands down. And I just appreciate the opportunity to work with Bill on this. This is just a fun story. We've just got a fun story here. Sometimes in history, you just find something that's just exciting from start to finish. And that's I think, the best way to describe this one. And during the Utah War of 1857 and 1858, Brigham Young's most influential non-Latter-day Saint advisor is Thomas L. Kane. And he's the Philadelphia philanthropist who came to the aid of the Latter-day Saints just many times, as early as the period of the Mexican War. And during this period of the Utah War, for a variety of reasons, there are periods before, during, and after the war because of distances. And the internet's going to be down for 150 years, so communication's tough. That these two men, Brigham Young and Thomas L. Kane, are just out of touch with each other. And they're not aware of each other's thinking. And one of these gaps, the gaps that just seems a little bit strange, or did seem strange, arose in the spring and early summer of 1858. This is when the Army is poised up in the Bridger area at Camp Scott, waiting to come into the valley, and things are pretty tense. And Kane has departed Salt Lake City for Philadelphia on May 13th, just a month and not quite a half before the Army does march into the valley. And the purpose of this presentation is to surface a hitherto unknown effort by Brigham Young to bridge this communication gap through the use of an encrypted letter. So it's got a little bit of a spy story attached to it. And he writes this to Thomas L. Kane on July 21st, 1858, has it courier delivered, we'll talk more about that, to Kane in Pennsylvania. It reaches him in September. And so during the over 160 years that have transpired since that letter was first written, this coded message was only known to just a handful of people. And so this presentation, and we'll add, it's going to be coming out in the fall issue of the Utah Historical Quarterly for 2021. It outlines the process that we worked on this message and the collaboration that occurred. It turned out to be an international group of code breakers who were involved on looking at this letter. And here's the actual letter. And you can see the only plain text on this letter is the first and top line, where it says Great Salt Lake City, July 21st, 1858. And so what we want to do is to shed light on this lost document, or previously lost document, and a little bit on the relationship between Brigham Young and Thomas L. Kane, and how those two friends collaborated during the war. And so what we're going to do for this presentation, it's going to look like this, just a quick little outline. I'll start with a discussion of Latter-day Saints and encryption. Then Bill will talk about the environment in which this letter is written and the Odyssey of this letter. It's kind of a strange history on how this letter came to be in his hands. And then I'll talk about the role that cryptologists played here just recently, and the actual encrypting and decrypting process, how the actual code worked. And then we'll look at what the letter actually said when it was decrypted. And then Bill will talk about how that fits into the milieu of the Utah War. And then a few closing comments at the end. So to begin with, we would just note that this is not the first experience of Latter-day Saints with codes and encryption and those kinds of things. In the revelations received by Joseph Smith that are recorded in this case in what's called Revelation Book 1, or the Book of Commandments and Revelations, this revelation is included, section 82 in the current Latter-day Saint Doctrine and Covenants. And in the revelation, it talks about the united firm and the financial dealings of the Latter-day Saint Church. And it addresses the Lord's servants, Edward and Newell and Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith and John Whitmer and so on. But when that revelation is actually published in the Doctrine and Covenants, it does not use the members of the united firm's names. When that revelation is published, this is a photograph of a page from the 1876 edition of the Latter-day Saint Doctrine and Covenants. Code names are used, such as Alum and Ahashdah and Mahalaleel and Paragorum and so on. And those code names appeared in subsequent editions of the Latter-day Saint Doctrine and Covenants, clear until the 1981 edition. It was only the second printing of the 1981 edition when all of the original names were restored to that publication. And in preparing this, and once the letter fell into Bill's hands, we just want to acknowledge the work of historian Artis Parshall. Artis has been very instrumental in looking at how codes and encryption and decryption have been used by Latter-day Saints. And her blog, Keep a Pitchin' In, has a multi-part series talking about codes with Latter-day Saints. So any viewers that want to do that can look that up on the internet and gain a little more understanding of this. At the time when I first got introduced to the letter, I was not aware of this, and Bill wasn't either. And this was brought to our knowledge with Artis and some other research, that this code that Brigham Young used in 1858 to encode this letter actually goes back, its roots go back to a guy named Robert Patterson. Now, Robert Patterson was a prominent Philadelphia mathematician, cryptologist, who had a lot of influential friends, including government leaders. One of them was a guy by the name of Thomas Jefferson, who becomes president, of course. And Patterson shares with Jefferson an enciphering scheme And Jefferson uses a variant of this. And in fact, an enciphering scheme was used by Lewis and Clark on their expedition. But the plot thickens for our story in the fact that Robert Patterson is a relative of a guy by the name of Judge John Kane. And that's Thomas L. Kane's father. And so Judge Kane apparently receives this encryption method, this coding and decoding method from Patterson, similar to the one that Thomas Jefferson gets also from Patterson. And Judge Kane uses this. And in fact, the relationship between Kane and Patterson is such that Judge Kane names his fourth son Robert Patterson Kane. And so you can tell it's a very, very, very close relationship. And using this system, there's a letter sent to Judge Kane on February 4th, 1858, that is a very, very similar looking code to the way the code that the letter that we received was built. And so this letter from February of 1858, there's lots of notes that were made with the decryption process, but the plain text is available. And Bill had actually used this plain text in earlier publications. At the time I got brought in on this, I wasn't aware of this February 1858 letter, but it was fun to see it after the fact and confirm what had actually happened along the way. So with that setup, let me turn it over to Bill to talk about what's going on in that.
Thanks, Ken. I just want to start my segment by echoing Ken's comments about the, excuse me, the fun of it all. This document welled up less than a year ago, totally unexpectedly for the two of us. And we sort of recognized immediately how unusual it was, chose to treat it as kind of late breaking news, and with the help of Jed Rogers and his co-editor Holly George at the Historical Quarterly, we've been moving forward on publication of it. So what you're getting today is in effect a sneak preview of the next issue of the Utah Historical Quarterly, which you'll probably see in early December, maybe late November. Wow, whatever the printer's deadline is. So with that background, let me then move to the subject of war and peace in uncertain future for Utah and how it relates as background to this message. Today's conferees hardly need a rehash of the Utah War's origins and prosecution, although a reminder of its conclusion and Brigham Young's view of the future might be helpful. By late March 1858, President Young was a man beleaguered, one surrounded by existential threats with seemingly no escape routes available. It was this encirclement, intolerable pressure to do something, and perhaps divine guidance that prompted Young to change strategy. He shifted plans from a direct military conflict with the Army in the Rockies and on the Great Plains to a different, more defensive strategy. Under this stunning new thrust, the Latter-day Saints abandoned Salt Lake City in northern Utah, prepared their infrastructure for incineration, and launched a flight south, first to a gathering spot at Provo, and then to a more distant haven, perhaps northern Mexico. The Nauvoo Legion was to continue its defense of the mountain passes into the Salt Lake Valley while fighting a rearguard action, if necessary, to protect women and children. Involving 30,000 people, what's come to be called the Move South was the greatest flight of refugees in North America since the American Revolution. While leading this abrupt about-face, Young focused on Utah's future under likely military occupation in an uncertain period of federally dictated reconstruction, as it's been called. Central to his thinking were the merits of yet another change in strategy to a comprehensive campaign of political manipulation, legal challenges, and public relations initiatives. After June 26, armed confrontation morphed into a continuum of non-military but still contentious legal, image, and political struggles. The opening gambit in this campaign was a new image for Young to be shaped by Thomas L. Kane. Young's anxiety to keep covert his linkage to Kane as well as the global scope of his ambitions, shows in his operating instructions to Horace S. Eldridge, his business agent. And Eldridge prepared to travel east, Young told him, quote, "Let your intercourse with Colonel Kane be confidential and move from place to place without attracting more than necessary notice. Not that we think you are apt to make any unnecessary display, but simply as a caution to be wise and discreet. And while you, with our good friend Kane, move the whole world, no one will know who has done it," unquote. It was within this context of strategic change and deep secrecy that Young's message to Kane of July 21, 1858, the one Kenneth described, took shape. Odyssey of a Strange Message. The identity of the person who helped Young to formulate and then encrypt this message on July 21, 3 weeks after the arrival of the Utah expedition in the Salt Lake Valley, is unknown, but based on knowledge of Young's penmanship, office routine, and use of clerical stenographic help, we're confident Young did not perform this task unaided. Once the job was completed, Young apparently felt there were additional things he wanted to communicate to Kane that were less sensitive than those he felt the need to encrypt. Accordingly, the next day, that is July 22, he dictated a 4-page letter that rambled through such subjects as his discussions with Buchanan's peace commissioners, troop movements, termination of the move south, Indian relations, and even his outdoor excursions. Upon finishing this dictation, Young asked his correspondence clerk not to finalize the rough draft for his signature, but to hold it open, undated, presumably so that he could add information if needed. Young then faced the practical problem of how to transmit these 2 documents, nearly 2,000 miles, to Kane in Philadelphia. Normally, absent snow in the Rockies and on the Great Plains, this would have required transit time of about 30 days by US mail. But for such documents, use of the federal infrastructure was out of the question in view of Young's firmly held belief that postmasters and their contractors routinely monitored his mail. Accordingly, as Young prepared these 2 messages, one encoded and the other in plain text, he would have begun the search for an eastbound Latter-day Saint or a trusted non-Mormon to serve as a courier. He found the latter in Hugh McElrath, a visiting representative of the New York mercantile firm of Robertson, Hudson, and Pulliam. McElrath had arrived in a deserted Salt Lake City about June 26, 1858, which makes it likely he had traveled at least part of the way west under the protection of the Army's Utah expedition. The purpose of his trip was to collect for his employer a long-standing debt of $37,000 owed by Hooper and Williams, an overextended Utah mercantile firm. Young had no direct business interest in this complex affair, but since 1855, he had tried to resolve it by corresponding with Robertson, Hudson, and Pulliam on behalf of a hard-pressed and frequently absent Captain William H. Hooper. When upon arrival in Salt Lake City, McElrath did not receive immediate satisfaction from Hooper. He decided to press his case directly with Young, whom he'd never met. He borrowed Hooper's carriage and drove to Provo, headquarters for the move south, with Lemuel Fillmore, a nephew of former President Millard Fillmore, who was in Utah as war correspondent for the New York Herald. As Fillmore told his readers, once he was in Provo, quote, "Mr. McElrath took a letter of introduction and went up to see Brigham Young, Esquire. He entered the Prophet's Square in Provo and soon found himself entangled in a multitude of said prophets, wives, and children. They were all mixed up together in admirable confusion. The children looked hardy and robust. At length, Mr. McElrath was directed to the president's office. Brigham is now always denominated president by the faithful. They've given over calling him governor. In church, they frequently say, Brother Brigham, etc. Well, after waiting some time in the office, the prophet entered. He was very courteous, gentlemanly, and interesting in conversation. Fillmore went on to say he was honorable in regard to the business upon which Mr. McElrath called upon him. Finally, the president invited the gentleman from New York to walk up to Sunday morning meeting with him. When there, the latter gave the former a seat of honor upon the preacher's stand, unquote. Whatever the discussions were in Provo between Hugh McElrath and Brigham Young, they produced results. When McElrath returned to Salt Lake City on July 1, 1858, with Young and most of the senior Latter-day Saint leaders, he received payment of the entire $37,000 debt in gold coin, a very large sum for the time and even now. It was a resolution of Hooper and Williams' outstanding obligations on a basis far more favorable than that extended to the firm's other creditors. With the New Yorker now obliged to him for this favor, Young obtained his agreement to serve as courier. As McElrath prepared to leave Salt Lake City in early August, probably aboard the eastbound Hockaday mail coach, Young instructed his correspondence clerk to finalize the letter he had dictated for Kane on July 22 by adding the date, August 6th, as well as a postscript explaining to Kane that both documents were being carried by Hugh McElrath and introducing him as an agent of the Robertson firm. When McElrath arrived in Philadelphia in early September 1858, he learned to his surprise that the Kanes were spending the summer in Elk County because, unknown to him and Young, Thomas had begun a new job as agent for a land development company in proximity to his family's unexploited timber holdings in western Pennsylvania. Rather than backtrack several hundred miles to make the delivery in person, McElrath put the Young communications, the coded and uncoded documents, in the U.S. mail to Elk County, where they arrived on September 24th of 1858, and he continued on to New York. This would not be the last time Young called upon Hugh McElrath for such courier service. Young's plaintext letter, dated August 6th, remained with the Kane family for nearly 140 years and was then acquired by Brigham Young University, or BYU. But what became of Young's encrypted message and the decoded version created by the Kanes in September 1858 in terms of their provenance? There is no copy of either document in the massive accumulation of documents generated and retained by Young and the members of the Kane family, and now housed largely in the research collections of the Church History Library and BYU's Harold B. Lee Library. At some point, presumably in the late 1960s or early 1970s, the encrypted version of Young's message gravitated to Talmage and Tal Luther, a bibliophile and antiquarian bookseller based first in Shawnee Mission, Kansas, and then Taos, New Mexico. Luther, whose collecting and selling focused on the American West, offered this document for sale in his catalog 63 as item 149. Luther described the document simply as, quote, written in code, and offered the observation, quote, any expert in cryptology would find this of interest, unquote. In February 1972, Archibald Hanna Jr., curator of the Yale Collection of Western Americana, frequent customers, bought the coded letter for $10. It remains at Yale today. And that's Archie Hanna on the left of your screen. Why Archie Hanna acquired a message he could not read is another of the mysteries associated with the document, since it left the Kane family's possession. And so encrypted and therefore unexploited, this document settled into nearly a half century of benign neglect in a file labeled, quote, uncatalogued Western Americana manuscript in Yale's elegant Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. When Hanna retired in 1981, His successor as curator was George A. Miles on the right of your screen. In 2020, with the stresses and changes brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, George Miles concluded the time was appropriate for urging Yale's library cataloging department to come to grips with the substantial processing backlog afflicting Beinecke. Unknown to me, among the items Miles succeeded in having cataloged was his predecessor's 72 acquisition, the $10 purchase. Later that year, on November 17 of last, I telephoned George, as I often did, to discuss his collection. Near the end of this conversation, there was a pause, and Miles cautiously, or rather casually, commented that I might be interested to know that the cataloging department had recently processed one of the oddities in the Yale collection of Western Americana, long overdue for attention. That may have been the understatement of the year. He then described the coded letter in terms of what little he knew about the Tal Luther Archie Hanna transaction 48 years earlier, and the document's brief heading in plain text, which, as Ken pointed out earlier, simply says, Great Salt Lake City, July 21, 1858. Although neither the message's author and recipient nor its contents were then known, Curator Miles' description was enough to immediately resonate with my more than 60 years of involvement in Utah War research. When I raised the possibility of a connection between this document and the war, Miles assured me he had already shaped the new catalog entry for what was now officially styled WAMSS 4203 UN 21, unquote, which in plain English reads undecoded cipher letter, Great Salt Lake City, Utah, 1858, July 21. So in shaping the catalog, it now reads in part, quote, the letter may relate to the Utah expedition, unquote. I asked Miles if it'd be possible to scan and send this document to me electronically, which he did immediately. As a non-cryptologist, I began to search for someone who could decode it. Late on November 17 of last year, I called genealogist, historian, and friend Odyssey Partial of Salt Lake City, who I knew had a long interest in the use of codes by the Latter-day Saints during the 19th century. Upon seeing the message, Partial's reaction was that it had been encrypted using a code unfamiliar to her, but she agreed to help me think through what type of code had been used. There followed several days of exchanged emails, during which artists became increasingly convinced that what was at hand was not an example of a simple substitution code, but rather one that used a prearranged grid, overlay, or shared key. On December 4th, I exchanged emails with artists observing, quote, this letter has to have been encrypted by someone in a key role in the church, army, or among the merchants, newspaper reporters, or federal appointees in Salt Lake City. Yet I can't think of a single instance of any such person using such a cipher during the Utah War in all the documents I've seen over the decades. I had forgotten about the one that I saw in the Kane collection decades ago. All of what I'll call the usual suspects have transmitted documents or messages that were very sensitive, I continued with artists. But to my knowledge, I said, they were all in plain text with security concerns being met by use of trusted couriers rather than the mails, or use of cutouts at the Salt Lake City end of the communications chain. The person only remotely in this ballpark was Thomas L. Kane, who did use a cipher system during his sojourn in Utah to transmit dispatches to his family using a matching Bible on both ends of the message flow. Ken?
So at this point then, we've got this cast of characters that's developed with Brigham Young, McElrath, Thomas L. Kane, and his wife Elizabeth. And Bill then thinks of me. And I have my background, I served 30 years as Jed mentioned in the bio, I served almost 30 years in the United States Army. And during that time, especially when I was at West Point, one of the things that I had to do was we had several visiting faculty members from the National Security Agency down at Fort Meade. And so Bill reached out to me on December 4th of 2020 and asked explained the letter, sent me a copy in email, and asked if I might have any ideas on how to decode it, or if I might have any connections on how to do this. So just at this point, we then started to think along the lines of, let's get some cryptologists involved and see what we can do. So just to kind of summarize this, we've got this letter. It's in complete gobbledygook. It's all encoded except for the initial plain text line. And then it starts with Brigham Young. And then, as Bill mentioned, it's carried by McElrath out to Philadelphia. He mails it to the Kanes in Elk County, Pennsylvania, where Elizabeth decodes it. And there, by the way, is an entry in her journal where she explains that she received the letter, that she decoded it, and that she had some difficulty doing so. And then at that point, then as Bill mentioned, it's held for almost 150 years, presumably in the Kane family possession for a while, but at some point goes then to Tal Luther. He moves from Kansas. He's in Shawnee Mission, Kansas, but then moves down to Taos, New Mexico. And he sells it then to Archie Hanna. And it's just stuck kind of in a box in a warehouse. I envisioned the last scene from Indiana Jones and the warehouse there where they put the Ark of the Covenant at the end. That's kind of the picture I have in my mind of the Beinecke's uncatalogued area. And then in the pandemic, one of the great things to come out of the pandemic is George Miles says, look, it's time. We've got to go through the boxes. Let's figure it out. So when he finds it, and then he gives it to Bill in Montecito in California, and then Bill gets a hold of me. And so once I came into the picture, my first thought was, after I realized I couldn't decode it, was to contact someone at the National Cryptologic Museum. Fort Meade, Maryland, where the NSA is headquartered, has the most wonderful spy and codes museum that you've ever seen. It's open to the public if you ever go by. I would highly recommend a trip. And so I contacted Robert Simpson there. Robert Simpson is one of the senior archivists and directors at the Cryptologic Museum there. I explained the situation, sent him a copy of the letter, and said, hey, what do you recommend? And he said, well, this kind of cipher isn't my specialty, but I know a guy. And so he connected me up with this guy. This is Klaus Schmey. Klaus lives in Western Germany. Klaus is one of, it is without overstatement, I can say that Klaus is probably one of the foremost experts today in cryptology. And he's the author of many books, consults with many governments, and is in several international cryptologic and cryptographic organizations. And I contacted Klaus, and Klaus immediately introduced me to his co-author of his most recent book, which actually came out the month that I contacted him. And that's Alanka Dunnan, and she's a professor in Nashville, Tennessee. And Klaus said, wow, your timing is really, really great. In 2 days, we are having a conference of the International Cryptologic History Crypto Collectors. It's the ICCH. And he said, that's going to be in 2 days. And he said, listen, here, I will just give you a pass to attend the conference. And if it's okay with you, I will take your letter, which I had sent him. And he said, I will put it before the experts from around the world who are going to be viewing this Zoom conference. So on that Saturday, on the 12th of December, I logged in, and there, this is on their opening screen. That's our letter down on the bottom there. And so I logged in on the 12th. It was a small conference, but these were really highly technical folks. It was interesting to hear the questions they asked during the presentation. And during their presentation that Klaus and Alanka gave, they introduced, as part of 10 mysteries in cryptology, they introduced our 1858 letter and put it right into their conversation. And much to my surprise, they introduced me in the conference and asked me to take several minutes and explain what we knew about the background of this letter, where it possibly fit, to also explain what the Utah War was. And so I ended up being an impromptu conference speaker. And then what Klaus did was Klaus pointed out that he had done some initial analysis on the document, and he initially thought it might be what's called a substitution cipher, as Bill referred to earlier, where you take one letter and substitute it for something else. But then he pointed out, he said, it just doesn't fit. I don't think we're going down the right road. And so he did note on page 2, there are some very unusual letter combinations. And quite frankly, what it looks like happened is the person that encoded this for Brigham Young kind of became lazy on the second page. And that turns out to be very helpful in breaking the code eventually. But what Klaus does is he opens up to this international community an invitation to solve this puzzle. And that becomes really, really important. And so what I want to do is take a couple minutes now and just talk about how this letter was encrypted and then decrypted twice. First in 1858, when it's encrypted and then decrypted by Elizabeth Kane, and then when it's decrypted again in 2020 without any help on understanding how the code works. And so this letter then is written by Brigham Young, or dictated by Brigham Young, and then it's encoded presumably by one of his clerks and sent out east, eventually, as we mentioned, reaching Mrs. Kane. Well, the way this encryption system works, and this is after piecing together all of the work of the cryptologists, here's how it works. And so I'm going to give you just a small sample of how we might use this in a very short 4-line letter. So this is not the actual text, but it does show how this code works. So what you do first is you write your message. And so Brigham Young presumably dictated or wrote the text. I'm going to start my sample message the same way Brigham Young did. This letter actually begins with Dear Colonel Kane. But for our purposes here, let's just say that our message is, Dear Colonel, send the money now. So the second step then, after you have the plain text, is you go through and remove all the spaces and all the capitalization. I've left it capital here so it's easier to read, but then all the spaces and punctuation, and now you're left with just the letters of the message. The third step is to determine how wide in each line, because you're going to have to hide your message text. How wide do you want that to be? So for this sample message, I'm going to say it's going to be 6 characters wide. And then what you do is you create a table. You take your text of the message and you just make a little table. So if it's going to be 6 characters wide, I divide the total number of characters, which in this case is 22. I divide that by 6, and then I round up. So that's going to be 4. So this is going to create a table 6 characters wide by 4 rows deep. And then what I will do is I write my message vertically. And this is the key. This is what made this letter a little bit tougher to decrypt than it otherwise would have been. So in my little table matrix, I'm going to write the first word, dear, like this. D is the first letter of the first line, E is the first letter of the second line, and so on. And then I will just continue completing that 4x6 little table with the text of my sample message, and it will look like this. So you can see there, Dear Colonel, send money now. Now, my message was only 22 characters, and I need 24 to complete my table. So at the end of my message, I just put a couple of junk characters. And the same thing happened in this 1858 letter that Brigham Young had encoded. And so that's the way the letter table is created. And then what I need to do is figure out a way to hide that table text in this letter. I need to hide it in plain sight, but I need to hide it in such a way that it can't be easily discovered. And this is where the magic occurs. It appears that Brigham Young and Thomas L. Kane both had the same edition of a Bible. That allowed them to share information because the Bible would be laid out the same. It would have, you could use page numbers if you wanted. And this part of the code, we don't know exactly what they used as the enciphering element, if you like, but just for purposes here, I have picked verse 28 of Genesis 45, this verse right here. And if we were going to use that as our encoding verse, I might slip that in a message, or maybe I've agreed with Thomas L. Kane, if I'm Brigham Young, that that's the verse we're going to use to encode the letter. But here's how it works. I look at the beginning letters of each word in that verse, and then I assign one letter to the alphabet. So A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and so on. Then this verse begins with, and Israel said, it is enough. So what I will do to encode is I'm going to figure out where to start hiding my text based on the words that appear in this verse. So for the first line, I'm going to start my real text at the first position because A is position 1. The next word is Israel, and Israel is letter 9. So I'm going to have 8 letters of junk and start my message on the 9th letter. The third word is said, and that's the 19th letter. So I will have 18 letters of junk and begin my real message at the 19th letter. And so on with the fourth, which is it, which is 9 again. So the way that works then is here's my table where I have my dear Colonel message that goes up and down. And then the first line of my letter that I'm encoding, since it's 1 from the word and, I'm going to start my first line, DCNEHNO, right at the beginning of that line. Then after that line, I'm just going to put junk letters. They just don't matter. For the second line, it was I, and so I'm from Israel. So I'm going to start my real message at the 9th position. And you can see the real message text in blue and the initial junk letters in yellow. And so on for the third line. I'll start at the 19th position. I'll have 1 letter of junk. And then on my fourth line, I'll start at the 9th position. And so you can see I've hidden that text in the body of that letter. If I have the Bible on the other end, I know where to look and how to decode it. So I know how to recreate that table. And once I've recreated that table, then I just take those letters from being vertical and put them horizontally. A multi-step process that poor Elizabeth Kane had to go through. And she says she struggled mightily with it as she's trying to do this. And so as she's doing that, she will know based on prearranged signals that this message, the actual letter that she's received from Brigham Young, that instead of being 6 wide like my sample, hers is going to be 24 characters wide. So once she finds where that characters begins based on a verse or however else they decided to use that Bible, she will write those 24 characters and rebuild that table. Once the entire table is built, then she will just take them from vertical and put them horizontal. And she's going to use that Bible. If she loses that Bible, it's a problem. But they both have the Bible and are able to encode and decode that message. So here's what a transcript of the first page looks like. And the letter or the numbers out on the side are the number of the positions where the actual message text begins. And I'll show out in 2020 in just a minute. But this table, ours in the little sample, was 6 wide and 4 long. The actual one on page 1 is 24 characters wide and 22 rows long. So it's a significant table with hundreds of characters in it. And the text in black background is the actual message. So for example, if you look at the first 4 lines and you look at the first character in each of those black text, it's D-E-A-R, dear, just exactly like our sample. And the next word is kernel, just like our sample. Well, on the second page, they had agreed that there would be a different system used. On the second page, it's 25 rows long and 8 characters wide. And it's just a different encoding system, but it's the same process, just the dimensions of the table is what changed. So when we reassemble the text, when we take those tables from the previous page and we write the text horizontally, then we start to see the actual message and we can start to actually read it, even though the spaces aren't there. For example, dear Colonel, the stock driven from the command last fall, and so on. And that's how that message worked. And I'm guessing it took Elizabeth Kane many hours to actually do this. And so let's now, you'll note on page 1, there's 1 junk character, a Y, and then on page 2, there are more junk characters at the end because it just didn't fit the dimensions of the table. Well, that's great for Elizabeth Kane because she had the Bible and she knew how it worked. But in 2020, when Bill received a copy of this letter, we didn't have the Bible. We didn't know what kind of code was used, and we absolutely did not know how it worked. So what Klaus Schmey did, the German cryptologist, is not only did he invite me to attend his conference, but the day before his conference, he posted on his German blog site this message, and here's an English translation of it. It just says, can you decipher an encrypted letter from the Utah War? And he put this call out. He has a large following in this community, and this is actually his Cyberbrain blog is I believe it's the most popular website in that community. And he is always posting every week. I've remained a member because there's some really fun stories that he posts. But he posted that and basically challenged this community from around the world to take on this letter. And he put copies of the letter up on the internet. And so what happened is when this was posted, there was a computer scientist who then at the time was at Heriot-Watt. He's now moved to the University of Edinburgh by the name of Adam Sampson. And he's a computer scientist, but he uses computers as a cryptologist, kind of as a side action that he does. And he took this on as a challenge and started looking at this very seriously and trying to figure out how to do this. And in talking back and forth with Adam, we've never met, but we've corresponded quite a bit on email. He said that he first tried every code-breaking piece of software he had, because there's a lot of software today that you can use to just run text through. And if it's any kind of substitution cipher, it'll decode it. And he said he was coming up nowhere. So then what he said, I realized, and in looking at the letter closely, he said, I recognized pencil marks all across the first page. And he said it was the pencil marks that actually broke the code for me. These are presumably pencil marks made by Mrs. Kane when she was actually doing the decoding process, because she needed to note where the actual message text began. And he said that became my guess, that the pencil mark would tell me the first part is junk, then it's my real text, and then there's probably going to be some junk at the end. He said, but I didn't know how wide the real message was. And so he marked all of the pencil marks, and this is just the top part of the letter. But then he said, on the 5th line, I noticed something. Elizabeth had done something on the 5th line. She had marked the beginning of the text and the end of the text. And that's the real text message. And he said, that's 24 characters wide. And he said, since it's 24 characters there, he said, I was starting to get a feel how this code would have worked. I guessed it was 24 characters wide on every line. And he used those pencil marks to figure out the code. And he was able to just by the 28th of December. So it was posted on the 11th of December. In just 17 days, Adam was able to break the code and decipher the first page of text. Now, interestingly, he tried to do the same thing on page 2 and came up with nothing. And so Klaus published the solution that they had found for the first page, and then put out a challenge to his community and said, hey, the second page is somehow different. Can you figure it out? And so what happened is another cryptologist by the name of Matthew Brown in England took the work that Adam had done on the first page and said, I'll bet what has changed is just the numbers of where the text is hidden, and the width of the text has changed. And because there are no pencil marks on page 2. Page 2 was a little bit more of a detective story because he just had to figure it out by brute force. And he said he finally broke the key when he took the correct number of letters and got some English words, and that helped break the code. And he figured out that's what the second page looks like, and was able to successfully determine how it works. It would have been much, much easier if we had the Bible and knew what verse they used, or what chapter sequence they used, or whatever way they used the Bible. But since they didn't have it, they were able to piece it together. And the amazing thing is within 3 weeks, they had completely broken this code and figured out how it worked. What helped Adam was on page 2, as I mentioned, the encoder became lazy. And he uses, if you look up above in the upper lines, he uses almost an alphabetic sequence. And then as he got further into it, he starts just using the same letters repeated over and over and over. And so Matthew said, I could tell where the actual text ended because the consistent junk, such as A, began. And he said, that's what actually broke the code for me on the second page. So if Brigham Young's encoder had been a little more patient and done a little better job with the junk text, it would have been much more difficult to break. Well, here's the text, and I'll turn it back to Bill to talk about the meaning of this message.
I think those of you in the audience, after thinking about what you just heard in the last couple of minutes, can well understand why, once I had reason to suspect this message had something to do with the windup of the Utah War and what followed it, Utah's period of Reconstruction, I called out for help first with Artis Parshall and then Ken Alford, and then he in turn reached out to the National Security Agency and the European cryptologists. So just thinking about this tends to make my head hurt, but if Elizabeth Kane could slog through it in Pennsylvania in the woods, I suppose we can. Well, with this background, we now turn to the plain text, which Ken has put up on the screen, of Brigham Young's relatively brief message, and then a few words on our analysis of its significance and meaning. Given the fact that one day later, Brigham Young wrote a much longer letter in plain text to Thomas Kane, and that both communications were couriered east, I just want to make sure my sound is on. It occurred to me I might be in mute. I guess it's okay. Given the fact that one day later, Young wrote a much longer letter in plain text to Thomas Kane, and that both communications were couriered east by Hugh McElrath in early August, historians might be tempted to discount the value of the encrypted message as somehow superseded by the second message. To do so would, in our view, be a mistake. The substance of the two documents is complementary rather than duplicative, and to marginalize the shorter encoded message is to miss its importance at a critical juncture in Utah's history as a distillation of Young's priorities for the territory's future. Here's a focus that provides historians, as it did Thomas L. Kane, with a summary glimpse into Young's thinking, free of the distractions of the rambling style that often shaped his prolix office dictations, such as that of July 22nd, 1858, as well as his sometimes hours-long Sunday discourses. So after setting forth at the top of the message, Great Salt Lake City, July 21st, 1858, which was the flag that got George Miles and my attention, maybe Archie Hanna before us. The letter reads, "Dear Colonel, the stock driven from the command, meaning the Army, last fall were offered to, received, and receipted for by the quartermaster. A sad mistake by the general," that is Albert Sidney Johnston. "Governor Cumming is bold for law and the rights of the people, and Secretary Hartnett and Superintendent of Indian Affairs Forney stand by him. The Page Boys commissioners talked much and handed us the pardon, which we accepted as far as burning wagons and driving stock were concerned. The rest you know. There's some contention between the law-abiding and the camp followers. Can you aid us in the removal of the troops? Officers, soldiers, and camp followers feel themselves completely whipped. A petition for the appointment of certain men has been forwarded to President Buchanan with the approval of Governor Cumming and Dr. Forney. A duplicate is enclosed to you. Can you induce a favorable action thereon? We shall change our delegate in Congress. Who shall we send? Give us a name. Yours would look splendid." Stripped of Utah's governorship, beset by apprehensions of assassination and accountability for the Mountain Meadows massacre, and embarrassed by the unfulfilled bravado of his quixotic pursuit of a Sebastopol strategy, creation of the Army of Israel, and execution of the move south, by the time the Utah expedition marched through Salt Lake City, Young had withdrawn to the safety and isolation of his walled, heavily guarded compound. He canceled worship services and other public appearances. Yet by the third week in July 1858, Brigham Young's resilience had returned. Although still sequestered and subdued, he resumed his ongoing efforts to shape the Latter-day Saints' future. By July 19th, 2 days before he wrote the message to Kane, his old combativeness flared to the point of a near clash in his office with Army guide Ben Ficklin, when Ficklin took umbrage over a casual reference Young made about Secretary of War John B. Floyd, a fellow Virginian. Only 2 days later, his encrypted message of July 21 set forth for Kane's use Young's agenda for a new life, one in uncomfortable proximity to the U.S. Army, while beset by the continued burden of unwanted federal political appointees. Aside from its value as a colorful example of Latter-day Saint use of codes, the primary significance of this document rests with the way in which it signaled two of Young's most important priorities. First, the removal or significant reduction in the new federal military presence in Utah. And secondly, a wholesale purge of the federal officials President Buchanan had appointed not much more than a year earlier. For the details of how Young pursued these two priorities, signaled in his coded message, we refer you to our article in the next issue of the Utah Historical Quarterly, as Ken mentioned at the beginning of our talk. And that's the fall issue, which will be out probably in early December, I would guess.
So when Thomas L. Kane departed Philadelphia to attend Brigham Young's funeral in 1877 in August, he did so under an alias. He traveled under an assumed name, much as he had assumed the identity of Dr. Osborne for his 1858 peace mission to Utah. And so 20 years later, the use of that alias again, may have comforted Kane, but it didn't mislead the Latter-day Saint bodyguards in 1877 who swung aboard his train in search of their protectee about 1,000 miles east of Salt Lake City. And after attending the funeral, Kane beheld the splendors of northern Utah for the last time as his eastbound Union Pacific train rocked and swayed through Echo Canyon. I can only imagine how bumpy of a ride that would have been. And as the red sandstone cliffs passed his view, he reached for his diary to record thoughts of Young's role in the Utah War. And the meaning of Kane's written musings remain as cryptic and enigmatic as the day he wrote them. But we choose to believe that in September 1877, that Tom Kane, who was certainly a special friend of the Latter-day Saints, as he was heading home to Pennsylvania, would have smiled had he known of what Apostle John Taylor, soon to be the next president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, if he had known of his earlier lamentation to Brigham Young from New York, when he was serving as the editor of the Mormon newspaper there. He said, quote, "I felt and said that I would give $500 for 5 minutes conversation with you. You must excuse me, Brother Young. I may be obtuse, and so may those who were with me. But however plain your words might be to yourself on this matter, neither I nor my associates could understand them." I think that's just a great statement from John Taylor.
So in closing, Ken and I want to express our appreciation to George A. Miles in Connecticut, Robert Simpson in Maryland, Klaus Schmee in Germany, Adam Simpson in Scotland, and Matthew Brown in England for the role they each played in surfacing and successfully decoding this little known and heretofore wholly unreadable letter from the Utah War. We're also grateful to Odyssey Partial of Salt Lake City for surfacing the link between Dr. Robert Patterson's long interest in cryptology and the Kane family's decision to safeguard its communications with Brigham Young through use of codes. Finally, posthumous thanks to Archibald Hanna Jr., who died in 2010. He was the founding curator of the Yale Collection of Western Americana, who a half-century ago had the intuition and the $10 to acquire this document when Tal Luther offered it for sale. Thanks very much.
I would just add my thanks as well. This is the international nature of this research has just been, again, just fun. It's just been exciting. So at this point, Jed, we'll turn it back to you, and we're happy to address any questions you might have or any thing you'd like us to discuss.
Yeah, terrific. If you want to, well, we can keep this screenshot up. Let me make sure that you can see everyone.
I can stop the share as well. Would you like that?
Either way, I think now we can see each other. So I have a couple of questions. I mean, this is it's a fascinating story. You did a terrific job laying out this multifaceted kind of detective tale, and I'm impressed every time I hear this. It's the first time seeing your slides, but I was familiar with your story. And it strikes me that we don't always get such a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the path that records take and the community of scholars that are sometimes needed to make sense of these records and to preserve them. So the story illustrates just how much historical scholarship relies on those who research, collect, preserve records, and in this case, the cryptologists and the crowdsourcing that you all did to get people invested in this story and to actually crack the code. I first wanted to ask you, describe the thrill of learning about the letter and cracking the code. For the two of you who know the records so well, I mean, I'm assuming it's fairly rare to find new records like this, especially one that's cryptid. What was the thrill for you last year when you came across this and went through the whole process?
Bill, go ahead, and I'll follow up.
Okay, for me, it was just the thrill of discovery. And when George described it as just having one line in plain text, Great Salt Lake City, July 21st, 1858, it immediately popped out in my mind as somehow related to the Army's passage through that city just a couple of days earlier, less than a month earlier. And then the question of what was it that was so important that it would be encoded, and who had the capability in that city at that time to do this was also intriguing. So it almost was, as I mentioned earlier, almost had the flavor of breaking news, just simply because it was so new to me to even think about this. This was not the first time George Miles and I had talked about treasures in the folders of uncatalogued materials. I mean, I won't go into all the details, but I can think of a document that he exposed me to in the 1990s that had been uncatalogued. It wasn't in code, it was a typed transcript of a soldier's diary, or reminiscences rather, that had laid uncatalogued and therefore unused and unknown to anybody other than the curator for over 20 years. So this wasn't the first time that this had happened, but the fact that it was coded and therefore so unknown and unintelligible added to the flavor of it. So the colorful nature of the document, as much as probably what might be in it, was half the fun. Ken, I don't know, how did it strike you?
Well, from the first time I saw the letter, it was just exciting. I didn't work with codes and cryptology in the Army. I did other things for the Army, but cryptology has always been kind of an interest of mine. I remember as a little kid, I learned substitution ciphers and made a Roman cipher stick where you write the alphabet and then you wrap it around a stick and the letter that's next to it. And so we sent messages in our neighborhood back and forth to each other and my buddies. And one of the highlights at West Point was in 2001. I got to keep for a week in my office one of the World War II Enigma 3-rotor encoding machines used for the ultra secret. It came from the NSA, actually came from the library or the museum at Fort Meade. And so I just had an interest in cryptology, just kind of as a side thing. And so to have this dropped in my lap, it was fun to get back in that world. Because I used to take cadets when I taught at West Point. Every year I would take cadets down to the National Security Agency for a classified briefing to just kind of introduce them to that world. And so that's how I was familiar with the Cryptologic Museum, because we always stopped by the Cryptologic Museum and would get presentations there. So it was just fun to be back in that world. But I was truly amazed the way Klaus, Adam, and Matthew latched onto this letter and just, I mean, broke it so fast. I just didn't dream. I thought, well, maybe sometime in the future somebody will figure it out. And I mean, it was just literally days before they had completely disassembled it and figured out how it worked. And so that was just fun. And to be able to read that letter from Brigham Young that nobody had read since Elizabeth Kane had deciphered it in September of 1858. It was just a thrill, because as Bill said, this just doesn't happen very often. But
and the fact that it was decrypted by people on a different continent who some of whom did not speak English as a first language, who were not Latter-day Saints, had never been to Utah, and had
never heard of the Utah War.
Absolutely had no idea about the context and background, is fascinating. Ken and I, over the years, have been back and forth on the importance of serendipity in the historical research process. That may sound a little odd to many of you in the audience, but both of us have benefited enormously by acts of serendipity, and it's different than dumb luck. It is not just sitting around waiting to get lucky. It's working hard so that you'll recognize things when they come along. This message and an understanding of it could have come off the rails at any of 20 or 30 different junctures in over 150 years. And it did lay unexploited in a file folder in a library for decades. But it got back on the rails thanks to George Miles in New Haven. But there were so many decision points here at which it could have gone into a dead end, but didn't. And the serendipity and sensitivity and the sense of collaboration and cooperation among the cast of characters that we've described today was absolutely crucial to it. So Ken and I are struck by the power of serendipity among like-minded, alert people in the course of finding, surfacing, and exploiting documents which are wholly new.
I would also add that the pandemic actually played a couple of times because the conference that I was able to attend just 2 days after contacting Klaus was online for the first time. I believe that was the first time they'd done it that way. They had previously met in various locations. And so because it was online, I was able to join at short notice. Also because of the pandemic, both of the folks that actually broke the 2 pages, Adam and Matthew from Great Britain, said that the pandemic had played in giving them a little bit additional time to to actually attack this code. And so, yeah, as Bill said, just all these connections, the serendipity is really, really fun when you're the beneficiary.
Yeah, there are a lot of points where clearly they've been serendipitous in and being fortunate, but also placing yourself wisely into situations where maybe you can crack that piece of the code. I'm struck by the fact that, again, the international community came together, Adam and Matt from Scotland and England, who encrypted the first and second pages of the letter. It strikes me that they maybe were doing this. I mean, they had expertise. Did they see this as being, I mean, what did they have in it for them? They were doing it for the fun of it. How much interest beyond those two did this letter generate among that little colony of cryptologists? You have a sense for that?
The blog posts, there were posts about every step of the way. And I really want to take my hat off to Klaus Schmey for picking this up, because, you know, one of those other points where this could have just died is if Klaus would have said, oh, you know, that's interesting, but we've got plenty of mysteries. He didn't. He just jumped right on it. And so because of that, and because of that community, I have to tell you, as I say, I continue to follow that Cipher Brain blog, and these kinds of mysteries are posted on a fairly frequent basis. They just recently posted a World War II postcard that was sent by a spy from London to Germany, and they asked their community if they could break it. And again, within about a month, somebody had broken the code and posted the results. So this is not, to that community, this kind of give and take, and you kind of get, as I've looked at this community, you kind of get brownie points within the community. I mean, there's nothing tangible, but just kind of street credibility points maybe as you decode some of these. And it's a community that just thrives and enjoys doing that. So this was, you know, fresh meat to that community. It's like, wow, something we haven't seen before. And then it turned out to be a code completely different to anything any of them had ever seen. They did not have any experience with that Patterson type cipher before.
Yeah, I'm sure that would have been interesting and thrilling for them as well.
I might mention just one payoff in my research that it provided. In the message, Young talked about getting rid of the federal appointees, either getting rid of them totally or trading them in for more Mormon-friendly appointees from the Buchanan administration. And he mentioned that a petition was being sent to President Buchanan asking that be done, and setting forth the reasons why in each case his appointees were persona non grata in Utah territory. The existence of the petition has been known, and I've written about it. The only copy of it is in the Thomas L. Kane papers at Yale Beinecke Library. It's not in the files of the federal government in Washington. It's not in the files of the president or of the Secretary of State who had jurisdiction over the territories. It's only in the Kane papers at Yale. And when I first came across it, maybe 20, 25 years ago, I was wondering how on earth did that get in there, but not where it was originally sent, which was to the hierarchy in Washington. And this message provides the answer to that. It was in the Kane papers because the message, the coded message that Hugh McElrath couriered to Pennsylvania had attached to it that petition as a matter of information for Kane. And while the feds lost it and didn't take any action on it, Kane received it, courtesy of Hugh McElrath, kept it, and it ended up in this enormous trove of Kane materials that are now scattered through about 7 different historical societies and university libraries. So that was an aha moment for me. I now know kind of why is the petition where it is, because we now know what transmitted it to Kane and in what way. So anyway, there are lots of little pieces of the puzzle that one gets that way.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the Kane family. One thing that I find very interesting is that this February 1858 letter was it from Judge Kane, Thomas Kane's father?
It's to Judge Kane.
Judge Kane. Can you give us a sense for what that letter said? And have you seen other examples of this type of encrypted coding in correspondence used by the Kane family?
The document you're referring to,
Did I get that date right?
It's on a little blue slip of paper at Yale, and it's the encoded message that Thomas Kane devised when he was sick and holed up in a hotel in San Bernardino. He had taken ship in New York, crossed the Isthmus of Panama, sailed up to San Francisco, decided he was going to get to Salt Lake City via the desert, not via the Pacific Northwest. I mean, when he set sail from New York, he didn't know how he was going to get to Salt Lake City. It was that much of an improvisation. So sick as the devil, he ends up in San Bernardino trying to find a way to get from San Bernardino to Salt Lake City. And he wrote a message to his father explaining what he was up to. And basically he was saying to the father, the Army at Fort Bridger is in even greater peril than I had realized. If you had known this as I now know it, you wouldn't have objected to my going west to Utah. And that was the reason why Kane wrote that message in San Bernardino before he headed out across the desert. And the reason it was in code was because what he believed to be the peril of the Army was so sensitive. He, as it turned out, was way overkeen to Brigham Young's military capability. He would not have wiped out the Utah expedition as Kane was sure he would, but that's why that message was written. And like almost everything else, the Kanes kept it when they received it, and it ended up in the papers. And then a lot of it went to BYU, fortunately, but a lot of it has been dispersed to Yale, Stanford, the American Philosophical Society in Pennsylvania, and about 4 other places.
Can you, I think, Ken, in speaking about the role that Elizabeth Kane had in deciphering this message, talked about how onerous it would have taken hours and hours for her to do so. So she had a lot of difficulty in coding it. What about drafting the letter? I mean, presumably Young dictated the letter to a clerk, and then the clerk had the responsibility of, putting it in code. Is that the way you see it? And how difficult would that have been to draft this letter?
Well, I think encoding and decoding was just a slow process. If you look when the article comes out in Utah Historical Quarterly here in the fall issue, readers will be able to see that there's actually an error or two. We've got it in brackets where we've corrected it, where the person encoding it, it's such a detailed process, because not only, by the time you write the letter, create the table, and then flip the table 90 degrees and do it vertically, and have to create a second table. In the process of all of that, whoever the clerk was that did it made a couple of little mistakes. They're tiny mistakes, and you can read past it, but you can see how that could happen. And then they've got to also do the encoding right. And again, we're not 100% sure. Let me be real clear. It's a guess that they're using the first letters of words in verses. It may have been, they may have used the Bible in another way. That seems to be the most logical. And there are other codes out there that do that. So I would think from Patterson's time, that's probably what he did, but we're not 100% sure. I mean, he may have used the letters of a verse backwards or something strange. But in doing that, you have to be really careful that you get the letters right. Adam Sampson said when he was trying to figure this out based on the pencil marks, a couple of the pencil marks are in the wrong place. They're only off by a letter. But he said the first time he did it, he got Dear Colonel. That's what kind of broke the code for him. He got Dear Colonel. He said, okay, I am on the right track. That makes complete sense. I don't know who the colonel is, but I know this is involved with something called a Utah War. So Colonel makes sense. But then as he went through and followed her pencil marks, some of them just didn't match up. So even as she's going through this Bible, trying to figure it out, she's just, it's just got to be just painful because it's a total, of what, 22 lines on the first page and 25 lines on the second. So almost 50 times you have to get this right. And then you have to pull out the text right. The other problem is when you look at that letter, the Brigham had some scribes that had beautiful penmanship. Apparently they were busy on the day that this letter was done because the scribe that did this, there are many letters. It is very difficult. We had the letter transcribed 4 different times to create kind of a master for that community. And we couldn't get the 4 copies to agree. And Adam even went and made his own transcription, and even his letters didn't agree. Some of the letters, quite frankly, only a couple, but some of them we had to figure out by retrofitting the text of the message onto the letter. And then we went, oh, whoa, that's a G. That's not a Q. Or that's not a P. And we were able to figure it out retroactively. But poor Elizabeth Kane didn't have the benefit of all those eyes and all the cryptology experience. And so I just imagine it was pretty painful.
If somebody in the audience has a clue as to who the clerk in Salt Lake might have been that took Brigham Young's dictation and then encoded it for Hugh McElrath to take east, we'd love to know what your thinking is. Artist Partial has led us to understand that Elder Samuel W. Richards, who had just returned as president of the British mission in May of 1858, was very interested in codes. In fact, he brought back a code devised by a Latter-day Saint in England to show Brigham Young how ingenious it was, but it wasn't the same one. And we have reason to believe that the handwriting on the message was not that of Samuel W. Richards. So, we started down that rabbit hole and then decided we did not know who it was that had done the encrypting. But it must have been an unusual person with an unusual mind. And we've found no diaries or correspondence of anybody saying, today was a brute at the office. I spent, 24 hours doing a code thing for President Young. We haven't found anything like that.
And whoever it was, their attention span ran out on the second page. Because when as you look at the full letter will be published, both pages will be published in the Utah Historical Quarterly. But as you look at that second page, the scribe, it just screams, I am so done with this. Because they just don't even try to be tricky. I mean, it's just, one line is just, it's all A's and one line is all I's and they might as well shine the spotlight on here's the end of the code.
There are all kinds of stories of Brigham Young's correspondence clerks, sleeping on the floor of the office overnight so that they would be ready if he came out of his little bedroom and decided he wanted to dictate it 600 or 700 letters. But in this case, we could see a clerk dropping to the floor for different reasons. In this case, out of sheer exhaustion.
And it's not that it's rushing out the door. And so the letter's dated the 21st. I'm assuming it's, encoded around that time, but we don't, that's a piece we don't have either. We don't know, is it actually encoded on that date and sits around waiting to be carried east, or is the letter done and then it's a rush job? I've wondered partially if it's a rush job that, McElrath saying, hey, I'm leaving. and so the guy goes, oh, to heck with it. And just sticks that in on the second page. Because the first page is, if we didn't have the pencil marks, I'm of the opinion, and I think Adam in Scotland is too, that without those pencil marks from Elizabeth Kane, we would still be waiting to break that code. It's without those pencil marks, it's a pretty effective code.
Elizabeth
with
was
computers.
enormously helpful and effective in this. And originally, the code decryptor on the Pennsylvania end of all this was to have been Judge Kane. In other words, when Thomas went west in January of 1858 to try to mediate the war, the arrangement for coding, decoding, and transmission to President Buchanan by courier was with his father, not with his wife. But once Thomas left, Judge Kane, maybe with intimations of his own mortality, he died a couple of weeks later, took Elizabeth aside and taught her what he and Thomas had agreed upon as the methodology. And as Ken said earlier, Judge Kane had received this from his distant relative, Robert Patterson, after whom one of Judge Kane's sons, one of Thomas's brothers, was named. He taught Elizabeth how to use this, and it's a good thing that he did, because otherwise what Thomas sent back from Utah in this late winter of 1858 would have been just gibberish and would never have gotten to the White House.
And presumably Elizabeth, as she's decoding this, she would have been writing, she's not writing in the margins of the letter itself. She's probably drafting the letter on a separate piece of paper. And that, of course, doesn't survive.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, the number of steps along the way to encode and to decode, and then, how you all fell into it, and the community of cryptologists that you enlisted. It's a fascinating story. I think really instructive to just show just how important we all are to each other in making sense of the record of the past. So congratulate the two of you for getting right on it and making fast work of this, and enlisting the right folks to help you out. It's an interesting kind of case study, I think, that I think is useful for us to see. So if there's anything more that you'd like to share with our audience, feel free. Otherwise, we'll leave it at that, and let folks direct people to the fall 2020 issue, 2021 issue of Utah Historical Quarterly for the full story, for all the details.
I guess we just note that just the speed of this whole thing, that a year ago we hadn't even seen the letter.
Yep.
And it all happened very quickly.
Well, thank you again, both, and for your good work. And again, thanks for all of you tuning in to this session of the 69th Annual Utah State Historical Society Conference.
Thank you. Thanks, Jed.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Jed.